what is going to come out of this coup against Trump. If there's a successful coup run by the deep state, because that's the origin of this, it's the CIA, the military security complex, the FBI. The Democrats are just taking advantage of it. If this coup succeeds and an American president is overthrown on a coup, then it means the end of whatever democracy we have left, because any future president knows if he gets in the way of the ruling elites, he's history.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the special interview. Today we have a first-time guest to the show, Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, chairman of the Institute for Political Economy. Dr. Roberts was Assistant Secretary of the Treasury under President Reagan. He's been an editor and a columnist at the Wall Street Journal and a prolific author of many books, among other things. Dr. Roberts, I'd like to thank you for joining us today on Silver Doctors.
Thank you. Pleased to be with you.
Now, Dr. Roberts, I'm looking at gold on the COMEX and I'm looking at open interest, and I see that, open interest seems to be making new record highs almost as quickly as the U.S. stock market major indexes are making record highs. What this leads me to believe is that there's an active policy to try and cap or suppress the prices of gold and or silver. Dr. Roberts, is there an active price suppression policy against gold and silver carried out by governments, central banks, or their agents?
Yes, of course. I've written a number of columns proving that over the years. They're all available on my website, www.paulcraigroberts.com. Dave Cransley and I think at times maybe John Williams has participated with our research, and perhaps Michael Hudson, but there are a number of columns showing the evidence. There's no doubt about it whatsoever. The Fed can prevent money creation from devaluing the dollar because the European Central Bank does the same thing, the Japanese Central Bank and the Bank of England. So if all the major central banks are printing money, the fact that the Fed doesn't affect the exchange value of the dollar. Mm-hmm. But what can show that something is amiss is the rising price of precious metals. So the way the COMEX market is set up, you can short gold without having to cover the short. That is, they're naked shorts. This, of course, is not permitted with stocks. But with gold, the big banks, the New York banks, they can simply print as many futures contracts as they want, just like the Fed can print as many dollars as it wants. And they also know how the hedge funds are positioned. The hedge funds always have a gold element in their models. So when the New York banks size up the situation, the hedge funds are in, and they print up a bunch of futures contracts and dump them in the market all at once. In a few minutes, a huge number will dump in. Well, of course, that's not the way people would make those kinds of trades. And so it drives the price down. That sets off the sell orders, and then it leads to other people that get caught with margin calls, and there's more selling. So then the banks who engineer this can buy it all back, cover their shorts, and put a lot of money in their pocket. And so it works. These banks are generally the agents of the Federal Reserve. And I assume if they're not acting explicitly on Federal Reserve instructions, they certainly have permission, because it would strike me that this is illegal. It's rigging a market and making money out of market rigging. But nothing is ever done about it. I once sent all the evidence to the Commodity Futures Trading Association and asked them, why didn't they look into this? I didn't even get an answer.
Mm-hmm. Now, Dr. Roberts, a lot of people would say that the rigging stems from the Exchange Stabilization Fund. Is the Exchange Stabilization Fund the entity that is on top of the control and the capping of the prices of gold and silver?
I don't know. I doubt it. I think this is the Fed and New York banks, but it could be. Mainly the Exchange Stabilization Fund. I don't know that much about it because I wasn't in the administration when that was created. It was the last year of Reagan, and it was done, as I understand, by the Bush people, who were afraid that there would be some market drop that would prevent George Herbert Walker Bush from being nominated as Reagan's successor and winning the election. So they wanted to be sure they could intervene to prevent some stock market crash. I think there had been a downturn in '87 and scared them. And of course, the Bush Republicans, they never understood the Reagan economic policy, and they were convinced that budget deficits, which were minuscule compared to the ones today, that these budget deficits were going to wreck the stock market and cost Bush the nomination. So they created this. Now, you never heard much about it or anything. A number of years ago, I saw an article in the back pages of a newspaper that said that the New York Fed, which is the operating arm, now had enough abilities to interfere in markets that it could interfere in any market. And the journalists actually asked the Fed, well, what is this all about? And they said, oh, we're just making experiments. So I've never seen any real explanation or analysis of it as a way of rigging the markets. But it does seem to be clear that that's what to do when the stock market starts to go down. They prevent this by buying S&P futures. So they step in, purchase S&P futures, and this stops the decline in the market. And we see this over and over. I think once Dave Kranzler and I, and maybe John Williams or Michael Hudson, we put all the information together, and it's on my site. We published it showing, I mean, it's circumstantial because nobody's going to tell you they're doing that. But so that's pretty much the way it works. They don't have to worry too much about the financial markets because all the money that's being created, not just here, but in all the other central banks, flows into financial assets and drives up prices. That's the reason for the long-running stock market rise, for the last 10 years. It's the extraordinary money that has been created first with quantitative easing and now with refunding. When the bonds come due, the Fed doesn't, they simply issue new ones. So all of this money, instead of going into the consumer economy and causing very strong inflation, is going in the prices of financial assets. And we see in countries like Japan where the central bank actually purchases stocks and owns, I think, a majority of the ETFs. So, and I think I did read that the European Central Bank now purchases stocks. So the central banks, which once conducted monetary policy by buying and selling bonds, they now are support operations for financial markets. And you can see that clearly when we have central banks purchasing and holding shares of equity shares. So whether this all is overseen by the Exchange Stabilization Fund, I don't know. I think it's mainly a Fed operation. The Fed knows it has to support the dollar because that is the main source of American power, the ability to pay your bills by printing money. As long as you're the world reserve currency, you don't have to worry about trade deficits.
So if I could interrupt you for 1 second, it sounds like, so the government and the central banks really do care about the price of gold because it's an effort to defend the dollar and maintain the financial stability and things of this nature. Because, back when Ron Paul, when he was a congressman, was asking Bernanke about, why do they hold gold? And he said tradition. So the central bankers and the government just avoids it altogether, but they really do care about gold and silver prices. Am I understanding that correctly here, Dr. Roberts?
Well, they don't care about them in the sense of being a legitimate market indicators. They care not to have them rising because that implies that there's something wrong with the value of the dollar and every other currency. So if the dollar is relatively stable or even rising with relation to the yen, the euro, the British pound, then the Federal Reserve is happy because it's protecting the world currency role of the dollar. But what would show this to be a hoax would be the rise in the price of gold. You remember some years back it hit $1,900 an ounce, and that's when they started in massive doses the selling of uncovered futures contracts, naked shorts. So, and they've done that ever since. There's no doubt about that. This is not speculation or opinion. And what you can see is that often when they interpret the financial press will interpret the fall in the price of gold due to the short selling. Oh, see, people don't really want gold. They're moving out of gold. But of course, they're buying all the physical gold they can get. It's going, the actual demand is going through the roof and the price is falling. Well, this doesn't make any sense in terms of economics. And normally when the demand is increasing, the price does too. So it just shows that the financial press, they're the same kind of prostitutes the rest of the press. They don't investigate anything. They don't ever challenge an official explanation. They just put out disinformation. So when you get right down to it, the price of gold can't rise if the New York banks decide to unload uncovered shorts and COMEX. And so, and then of course, I described that process, and it plays off the hedge funds, their positioning.
Now, you had mentioned the Japanese central bank outright purchasing stocks. There's been some sort of speculation here about whether the Fed would eventually do that or not. However, it's no secret that President Trump has been open about his desire for what I would interpret as a weaker dollar. He's also openly on Twitter called for negative interest rates, implied by saying our rates should be lower than Germany and Japan and whatnot. What is your outlook of the dollar and interest rates in general? Do you think that interest rates could go negative here? How do you see Trump's role with the dollar? And there's a few different questions there. So however you would like to take that, Dr. Roberts.
Well, I don't think the dollar is in any danger until we see more movement away from its use. You know, we hear about the Russians and the Chinese and the Indians. These are very large countries moving out of dollar payments, moving away from the SWIFT clearance system and setting up a payment system in terms of their own currencies so that They no longer settle their international payments with dollars. So I don't know to what extent this is actually now in effect, probably not very thoroughly. But once it is, I mean, once they get all these loose ends tied up and they're working this way, then you see the demand for dollars as a transaction currency has dropped. So, and you see the same thing can happen if oil payments aren't settled in dollars. So when you see this movement away, which has been encouraged by sanctions. So in a way, the sanctions are undermining the dollar's role as world reserve currency. When you see this happening, then you know that sooner or later the dollar is going to lose that role. Not enough of world trade is going to be settled in dollars, and therefore then the trade deficits become a problem. And offshoring is the main source of American trade deficits. People don't understand this, including the White House. But when the American firms move the manufacturing jobs offshore, and when they move tradable professional skills offshore, like software engineering, research, design, what they do, the firms that move offshore and make the products and they bring them back here to sell, that counts as imports. So at least half, if not more, of the alleged imports from China are actually the products of American firms, Apple and Nike and Levi and all the rest. So when you when you have that type of situation, and how do you get out of your trade deficit? It's not like you see your own firms who are supposed to be producing and selling abroad to cover your imports, instead are adding to your imports because they've offshored their production. So most of these things that are called Chinese imports are not Chinese. They're the imports of Apple and Levi and Nike and so on. So you can be in a very difficult situation if you lose the world reserve currency. And your own companies are a major source of your trade deficit. Well, that's the situation the United States is headed to. It's already in it. It's just not biting. I mean, it's not biting hard because we can still print money to pay our trade deficits. As for the budget deficits, a lot of people, the budget deficit, we're broke, we'll be ruined. But that's not true. The Fed can print all the money it wants. It can redeem these bonds are redeemable in dollars. Mm-hmm. So there's never a problem of redeeming the federal debt. The Fed can push the buttons. If 100 trillion isn't enough, they'll make it how many? 1 trillion. Mm-hmm. So as long as the U.S. treasuries are denominated in dollars, there's no problem paying them off. And you don't have to, the taxpayer doesn't have to pay them off. The only danger is if all this money that pays off bonds by being printed to pay off bonds, if it gets into the general economy, then you can have hyperinflation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, Dr. Roberts, when we look at it from like the bottom up, like if I'm looking at, bringing manufacturing home or bringing the jobs back, I just look around and, I see, generally speaking, a population that is not physically fit, that is completely out of shape. I see identity politics and affirmative action taking over everything. I see a population that is arguably not getting smarter, but is in fact being dumbed down. So, and I also see an entitlement mindset, an entitlement class, where a lot of people think they're entitled for whatever reason to some sort of government benefit. So my question to you, Dr. Roberts, is how do we bring manufacturing back in the face of these things that I have just described? Is there even a population that can enter in and grow up a manufacturing workforce in the United States anymore?
Well, you'd have to undergo economic development. So what the offshoring does is it turns you into a third world country, and as important, or perhaps more important than the elements you just gave, the supply chains are gone, the infrastructure is gone, and so even if you had a disciplined workforce, and of course that's gone, because manufacturing is, if you're part of a manufacturing workforce, you have to have discipline. You got to get up. You got to be at work every day. You have to pay attention to what you're doing. You screw something up, you've destroyed thousands and thousands of dollars of product. And so it takes a reliable, disciplined population to work in manufacturing. And when you lose manufacturing, that population gets old and dies, and there's nobody to train. They haven't trained anybody. So you don't have that. But you also don't have the supply chains. And so you have to re-enter the process of economic development. The United States is descending into India of 60 years ago. And India, of course, is rising into the United States of the 1960s, 70s. So you're faced with a huge problem. Plus, the corporations don't want to bring jobs back because they still can have much lower labor costs abroad than here. And
an arguably more efficient and disciplined workforce because they're actually doing it in the here and now.
Yeah, but the labor costs are still massively different because it's just expensive to live in the United States. And people are finding it harder and harder to do on the kinds of jobs that are available.
Now, I don't recall how long ago it was you said that America would be turning into the third world. And I generally agree with you. I was in the United States Army, I was in Iraq, I lived in Mexico for a couple years when I was in college. So, I've been around the world, I've seen things. And my general opinion is that the standard of living in the United States is going to go down, and in other places it can really only go up. But how close is the United States from turning into the third world, and what is that going to look like for, say, your average blue-collar worker or just for Main Street in general, Dr. Roberts?
I don't know how many blue-collar workers are left. It'd be interesting to find out, but most of when you look at the payroll jobs reports, the monthly payroll jobs reports, most of them are lowly paid domestic services. They're not the kind of, and increasingly they're part-time. So that's not exactly a blue-collar worker. It's something below, considerably below a blue-collar worker. So those kinds of jobs don't really provide the means for an independent existence. And this is why we have these Federal Reserve studies which conclude that there are more people aged 24 to 34 living at home with parents than living independently. So the jobs simply will not fund an independent existence, rent, car payment, student loans. And in fact, we now know that among the homeless, many of the homeless have jobs. They just don't make enough to pay rent. So they're working. They're not bums, but they haven't to live on the streets. So you could say we're already India. I mean, we have already transitioned into the slippery slope down. So how do you get out of it? You probably can't.
This is where I wanted to ask you, Dr. Roberts, because this morning you wrote, and this is a quote here, The word went out everywhere in Republican circles. Do not compromise yourself by standing by President Trump. He will not rescue you from false prosecution. When I read that this morning, what I thought about was rallying around the captain of the Titanic, because if I would think that the United States economy is the Titanic, then it's going down. Is the United States economy the Titanic? Is it going down? Can we support President Trump? Is there anything he can do? How do you see this? Because I also know that you said you would be willing to give President Trump a chance when he was President-elect Trump. So there's also a couple different questions there, however you'd like to take it, Dr. Roberts.
Well, I read something this morning. It was very interesting. It was in the Occidental Review. I guess that means the Western Review. We'd probably be considered a white male site because, the Western Civ, all this stuff. It was an article, I think, by a Frenchman. And it said, Trump's a lot smarter than we think. He's got a plan. And what he's really doing, he's destroying globalism. And he does it by all the outrageous things he does. And he's forced Russia and China and India out of the dollar and leaving the SWIFT system. And he's made American foreign policy repugnant to the rest of the world, even threatening, we're even now threatened by some of our European puppets that they won't go along, and that he's going to bust up NATO, and that he's actually doing all this intentionally. And the idiot left wing and the liberals, they say, oh, he's a buffoon and he's this, but he's actually destroying the global world that they had put together. And so I thought that was a very interesting take. I don't know that I agree or don't agree, but it was a very interesting way. And you can see whether he's intending to do that or not, that is the result. So I posted a link to it today because I thought people should think about this, because you can say, this is what's happening. We were already discussing it. What's going to happen to the dollar when they leave the dollar payment system. So it could well be he will succeed. And if you look at the Democratic candidates that they want to run, they're all a joke. These aren't people of any capability. They can't. And how long can the elite run it just for their benefit? You see, even the offshoring by the corporations, it helps them in the short run because the labor costs go down, the profits go up, but it destroys the domestic market. Instead of people making 50, 55, 60 grand a year in manufacturing, they make $18,000 a year working at Walmart. Well, that's a huge drop in the purchasing power of the population. So what the Keynesian economists would call aggregate demand can't grow if the high productivity, high value-added jobs are moved offshore, and the only thing you have is low productivity, low value-added jobs. Then the income growth of population ceases and declines. And so what then who are the customers for Apple and Nike and Levi and all the rest who've gone offshore? Who are their customers? So in the short run, you can fill in the missing income growth with debt. So they can run up consumer debt. But of course, it's run up now. And how do you take on more debt when the income you have won't support the debt you've already got? So they've run out of the ability to fuel aggregate demand with an increase in consumer debt. So the whole thing, eventually doesn't work for the people who cause it. Or the firms. There's who's going to pay $2,500 for an Apple computer, or $800 or $1,000 for an iPhone. They don't have it because, they're lucky if you make $1,000 a month. So there are natural limits to this. And so if it all collapses, then you just have massive poverty, unemployment, crime.
It sounds like the only solution to this will, in fact, be MMT, modern monetary theory. Is that where this is headed, Dr. Roberts?
Well, you see, that works if you have a viable economy and you're trying to finance infrastructure. Because if you're creating money for the purpose of productive activity, that's what the banks do. That's what the Fed does. So you don't need to involve debt, just print. So Michael Hudson and I have been trying to convince the Russians of this because they have the same kind of crazed neoliberal economists that we do. And so they think, oh, we can't self-finance our investment projects. Well, they can, but they've been brainwashed by the neoliberals. So what they think they have to do is borrow foreign currencies. But you can't spend foreign currencies in Russia. So what happens to them? They go into the central bank reserves, and then the central bank creates rubles. Well, so when they get these foreign currencies, all they're doing is acquiring an interest obligation. They don't need the foreign currencies, just create the rubles and finance the infrastructure projects or whatever they want to finance that's productive. And so that's what modern monetary theory says, and I think that's correct. But you have to have a performing economy. You have to have an effective economic system. You can't have one that's degenerating into underdevelopment. If you're in the process of becoming India 60 years ago or 100 years ago, then how does this work? Who needs the infrastructure? If all the firms are offshore, supply chains.
Well, the other thing that I think of, Dr. Robert, when I'm listening to you, is that when, let's say that the government was going to embark on this and spend $100 billion in bridge upgrades, well, I'm immediately thinking that the bridges aren't going to get upgraded. Almost all that money is going to get squandered away to special interests and corrupt politicians in Washington. Is this what we've come to, or do I need to have a little bit more faith in the system than that, Dr. Roberts?
I don't think there's any reason to have any faith in the system. It's true, a lot of the money will be lost in rigged bids. They'll be lost in union obstructions and payoffs, but again, if your economy is in decline, what are you going to do with infrastructure? So you first have to solve the problem of why the economy is in decline. Now, I've shown a way that you can bring firms home. This is not a question of tariffs. The whole tariff thing is absurd because the tariffs are falling on Apple and Nike and Levi's. So they're not falling on Chinese. So what you do, you just tell the firms, okay, look, if you produce abroad the goods that you sell at home to Americans, you're going to have a high tax rate, and we're going to raise the tax rate sufficiently that it negates the cost advantage of producing abroad. But if you produce at home the goods you sell at home, you have a low tax rate. That's the way you could bring them home. You have to bring them home in a way that they'll go along with. Now, you might have a hard time with the corporate lobby getting that passed. On the other hand, it's not making them worse off. You're saying, okay, look, come back, save your domestic market, and this is the deal. So that would be a way to try to bring the jobs home. You're really going to have the corporation all of these corporations, because they just have so many abilities to buy the House, the Senate, the campaign contributions. They're a strong lobby. So you have to get them on your side. Well, that could work. The tariffs don't work because the tariffs on American goods that are produced offshore.
Do you see a trade deal coming, Dr. Roberts?
There's no such thing. All these are wrong words and terms that are created intentionally to confuse people. I mean, they call NAFTA a trade deal. They call WTO a trade deal. These are just all deals to help corporations reduce their cost by producing offshore. These are nothing to do with trade. They have to do with rigging things so the corporations make money that they normally wouldn't make. But again, as I say, it's a short-term or intermediate-term thing. It can't last forever. So when they talk about trade deal with China, this is just disinformation. It's a way of confusing. It's not about that. In fact, the Chinese now have all our technology. They have a massive domestic market. It's about 4 times the size of ours. They don't need to sell anything here. They can develop their own domestic market. They know, because of the offshoring firms, they've got the business know-how, they've got the technical know-how, they've got the infrastructure. They can do modern monetary theory, finance anything they want. They don't need anything from the West whatsoever. So it's stupid to have this conflict. And the conflict is really not between Trump and China. It's between Trump or us and the global corporations that produce offshore for their domestic markets. I consider that treason. The neoliberal idiots, they try to say it's free trade. Of course, it's not free trade. Free trade requires that your companies stay at home. They find their most advantageous way of producing. They stay at home and produce things they sell abroad so that we can pay for our imports from abroad. Free trade has nothing to do with your firms leaving the country. Both Adam Smith and David Ricardo made that explicit, that this is not the operation of comparative advantage. This is the operation of, what's the term? But it's the opposite, because your capital is left. And so it's not home finding its comparative advantage. So it's a mess. We can't get any help from the economics profession. They're neoliberals, basically idiots. I can't think of one neoliberal proposition that's correct. It's all designed to serve banks, to serve the financialization of the economy, to define any form of profit as an increase in real output, which is not. Essentially, it's a hoax. And this hoax exists everywhere, in Japan, in all over Europe. We exported it to China, to Russia. They suffer with the neoliberal nonsense. And it's really capable of bringing down the whole world.
Now, in the past, you have been.
It would, except that in Washington, beginning with whoever started the sanctions, have forced the Russians and other countries out of the neoliberal system. So that's my take on it.
And as for closing comments here, Dr. Roberts, and I appreciate all your time today. As we move into the end of the year, What are you going to be looking at in the economy and in politics? What's on your radar the most right now, Dr. Roberts?
Well, I don't think there's anything about the economy. I think the Fed will continue to support the prices of financial assets, and they can for now. So fundamentals don't mean anything anymore, because when fundamentals meant things, that's before the Fed was supporting the prices of financial assets. If the Fed is not going to let the stock market go down because it's going to step in and buy S&P futures, and it's not going to let the dollar deteriorate in terms of gold because it's going to have the New York banks sell naked shorts, then it's got control. And the notion it's going to lose control is not. I mean, they could, and maybe they might decide, oh, we got to get rid of Trump, so let's wreck the economy. They could do that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the real thing is what is going to come out of this coup against Trump. If there's a successful coup run by the deep state, because that's the origin of this, it's the CIA, the military security complex, FBI. The Democrats are just taking advantage of it. If this coup succeeds and an American president is overthrown on a coup, then it means the end of whatever democracy we have left, because any future president knows if he gets in the way of the ruling elites, he's history. And all the people know, well, it's no good electing another Trump because they're not going to let him do anything. And so you just move into total control, unprotested, by the elites, the oligarchs, the deep state, the military security complex. So that, of course, would be a horrendous development, because it basically means that there's no possibility of any accountability in government.
Dr. Roberts, I'd like to thank you for joining us today on Silver Doctors.